Good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time of day it is for you. This is Jeff Besson, Intuilab's Chief Marketing Officer and #1 fan. And I'll be spending the next X number of minutes. We're booked for an hour. Let's see if we can do it. Spending the next X number of minutes introducing you to Intuiface. Intuiface has the word intuitive in its title, so it better be intuitive, right? But the reason we have a webinar like this is just to make sure we dispel any potential confusion. Intuiface is a lot more than slideware, interactive slideware, way more than that, and hopefully I can prove that to you. And it's also probably a lot easier than you think as well. You would imagine, okay, if it's multi-touch and it does all these things, I must have to write code or do all these very advanced techniques. No, it's not hard. Again, I believe that by the end of this webinar, not only will I have proven my point, it is intuitive, it is easy to use, it is more than slideware, you'll actually be building things already. That's how easy it is. So let's see if you can prove me wrong. I want to start just with a little bit of an overview, starting with what can you build? Intuiface is used to build interactive experiences. This experience that I'll be showing you today, I'm running Intuiface on my laptop. There's a video embedded in this experience. When you get it at the conclusion of the webinar, I'll share it with you. You'll get to run that video and see some examples of what you can build with Intuiface. We call it an experience because it's really for any audience, whether it's in a hosted environment, you have a speaker, some kind of host, or in a self-service environment. It's for any audience to whom you want to impart some sort of message or some kind of information. It could be a retail point of sale application, it could be a curated art exhibit, it could be in real estate, could be in commerce, could be a sales pitch, trade show, customer briefing center, you name it. Tourism, everything. On the screen now you'll see some screenshots of experiences created with Intuiface, and hopefully one thing you'll note is that they don't look the same. You literally can control every single pixel of the design you create and realize using Intuiface. You control everything. You don't buy templates from Intuilab. You don't buy prefab from Intuilab. You buy the ability to realize any design using the Intuiface product. You'll note that not only is there no template restriction, there's not even a format restriction. We have both portrait and landscape orientation. You can deploy even to a multi-video display wall. There is no limitation. You can use virtually any Windows plug-and-play display on the planet. As far as I know, if it's plug-and-play Windows, you're working with it. Not to mention other platforms that I'll mention in a moment, but certainly keep in mind this is not about bullets on a slide. This is about any design for any audience using your content. There are 3 products in the Intuiface family, 2 of which are licensed. There's a license for Composer, this is a license for Player, Management Console, everybody has access to it, you don't need a license. Composer is the editor. That's the tool you use to create your interactive experiences. Player is the runtime. It's the tool you use to run your interactive experiences. Management Console is a web-based tool you use to share and deploy your interactive experiences. Okay? Composer to build, Player to run, Management Console to manage. Composer runs on Windows, Windows 7, Windows 8, and eventually, when it comes out, Windows 10. If you're on a Mac, you can use Boot Camp or something like Parallels, but it needs to be Windows. For Player, it's iPad, Android, and the Samsung Smart Signage platform, in addition to Windows. So 4 platforms on the Player side. Management Console, it's in a browser. You use whatever browser you want. It doesn't matter. Okay? For the purposes of this webinar, the only thing we're going to talk about are Composer and Management Console. We don't talk about Player because there's nothing to see. It just is a runtime. That's all it does. It runs the thing you build. And it is certainly possible that as a customer, and I'm sure you will all be customers very soon, that as a customer you may only need a small number of composers but a very large number of players. Right? You might only have 1 or 2 people building experiences, but you might be deploying to thousands of devices in the field. Design agency, right? You might have one customer with 10 devices, another customer with 2, another one with 100, multiple projects, multiple players. Maybe only 1 or 2 composers. And again, Management Console is a website. There's no notion of limitation or license or anything. Everybody has access to it. We actually got the question at the beginning about free edition, paid edition. So let me clarify that for a bit. If you've been to our pricing page, you may have noticed there are, in fact, 3 editions of Composer, Free, Pro, and Enterprise. There are no editions of Player. With Player, what you're buying is the platform and the duration, but there's no edition. For Composer, there's an edition. Free is free. Pro and Enterprise have a price tag. Everything I show you in this webinar can be done with the free edition. Everything. On the rare occasion that I did mention something that requires the paid edition of Composer, I will alert you to that fact. But everything we talk about in this introductory webinar you can do with the free edition. Quite honestly, the feature overlap is, even for the Enterprise edition, fairly significant. Over 90%. Tons. Of course, at the end of the day, we'd like a little bit of money, and so the free edition does have some limitations. For example, there's a watermark whenever you play your experience. But by and large, anything you can do in Pro and Enterprise you can try in the free edition, which is time unlimited. It's free. You have it forever if you want it forever. So that's it. That's the background. Well, I guess one other final point. Composer embeds Player so you can test your work. In Composer, you can see, I'm in Composer right now. Here's the play button. If I push play, what I'm actually saying is, please run this experience in the embedded Player. So you do, in fact, have Player when you want to test your work. That's what the play button does. But for deployments, you want separate players because you get large quantities. And you want Composer everywhere. That's it. That's the preamble. I'm ready to talk about Composer. Any preliminary remaining questions, Seb, before we jump in?
Nope, nothing for the moment.
Okay. Let's start by taking a look at Composer, getting a lay of the land. In the upper left-hand corner of Composer, I'm looking at this panel right here. This is the Spaces panel. This contains all of the spaces used in my experience. You can think of them as slides. We call them spaces. Of particular significance is the fact that the order of the spaces may not have any relevance to what your users experience in a real environment. With slides 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that order is pretty relevant typically. You can go to a slide, but typically you're going sequentially. With Intuiface, it may not be remotely sequential under the covers. Under the covers, your visitor might be going from space 1 to space 20 to space 6 to space 50. It's possible because their navigational path is determined by their decisions, which may have no relevance to the order of your spaces. Of course, under the covers, the order might be very relevant. You're the designer. You want to organize your work, make it manageable. Maybe you're sharing it with colleagues. Okay, so this order might have some relevance on the design side. From an execution perspective, it may or may not. Whichever space I select in the Spaces panel, its content is revealed in the center panel that we call the scene. This is where you do your editing. As you'll see shortly, it's a what you see, what you get editor. Everything I add here, you can see it, you can manipulate or rotate it, move it around. It's very explicit. So whichever space I select in the upper left, I have its content visually here in the scene. And in the bottom left, I get a summary of those items by name and logo. So for example, here's an image called Intuiface logo, and you'll notice it's highlighted in the scene. If I select this particular text asset, here it is up there in the scene. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between everything I see and items in the space content panel. Of course, some items might be invisible. They might be hidden. I would still see them in the space content panel. I just wouldn't see them in the scene. Note how there are layers in the space content panel, back, middle, and front. Visibly, you can see an x-axis and a y-axis, but there's also a z-axis in and out of the screen, which is very important when you're creating an interactive experience. That Z order is critical. It affects your design. It affects how people interpret what you've put on screen. So we have 3 explicit layers, back, middle, and front, and then within each layer there's an implicit notion of layering as well. So this order has relevance in terms of depth. So it's predictable when you build your experience. So now you know what spaces are. You understand the purpose of the space content panel. Now you're an expert of organization of an experience in Intuiface. Let's now talk about assets and collections. Assets are the basic media you use to create the visuals and the audio. It's the images, the videos, the documents, the maps, the 3D models, all that stuff. Those are the assets. You can combine multiple assets in the same scene, in the same space. You don't have to pick. Again, there's no restriction on how you organize your work. If you just want a bunch of images, great. Or you can have something very complex comprised of multiple items. That's okay too. So let's go to a list of images I've prepared for this webinar. Here's Pee-wee's Big Adventure, a favorite of mine. I'm dragging that image into my space. Again, it's a what you see, what you get editor. That means I can manipulate it directly with my mouse, and that's how it's going to look at runtime. So here's Pee-wee's Big Adventure. I'm pushing play. So I have a very simple experience right now. It's a scene with just a single image in it. Notice as I use my two fingers, I can manipulate this image, resize it, rotate it, transpose it across the screen. I didn't have to tell it to be interactive. It just is. As you'll learn in a few minutes, with properties I can constrain whether or not I can move it, what have you, but by default you can manipulate it as you wish. Images are particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. One is will allow me to reinforce a point about how you control every pixel, because right now what you see is an image on top of a background, but you know that background can also be controlled. If I select the background, look at the space content panel. I'm not in a layer. I'm on the space itself. That background has a property called background that's currently set to an image. I can drag in another image. So here's another image. This is formatted as a 1920 by 1080 image, which is the dimensions of my screen. It's the dimensions I've configured for this particular experience that we're playing with. All I have to do is right-click that image and say Set as Background, and it replaces the original background with the image I just dragged in. Every single pixel, and this is just a background. It's not an image. There's nothing about Z order or stacking things. It's just an independent property that lets you control every pixel. In fact, not only can I do an image, I can do a video. I mean, if you look at the properties panel at the bottom, I can choose from a color, an image, or a video. I can run a video on a loop in the background with a single property. See how simple that is? Now I'm going to go back to the original background because it's just more amenable to the rest of the content, but you get the idea. So here we have an image. Let's add a little bit more content. We have a, here's my video. So we'll add a video to my space. And we have a PDF, which is right here. If any of you have gone through the tutorial, you'll have noted that its theme is Tim Burton, and we're using the same content here. Here's a PDF document, video, and an image. Again, I can combine multiple asset types in the same scene. That's not a problem. Pushing play. And let's do a little mega multi-touch. So I'm resizing the image, and at the same time, let's play the video. So now the video is playing, and I'm moving the book at the same time. And now let's do this. Let's pin the book so I can change pages as I move the video, the image. I don't know how well that worked in the screen share, but you'll note that I was using multiple fingers at the same time. Of course, if you're running an experience on a 22-inch laptop, supporting 64 concurrent touch points doesn't make a lot of sense. But in fact, you could run Intuiface on an 82-inch Perceptive Pixel, where it's perfectly possible you might have multiple people using it at the same time, and Perceptive Pixel supports 64 concurrent touch points. So we are not limited by the software. Our only touch point limitation is the hardware. So all of this can be true multi-touch, not one or two fingers, but I mean real multi-touch. So here, we have multiple asset types. What other asset types are available? Images and videos. Webcam, you could have a live webcam video feed and even take snapshots. Document we discussed. Web browser, you can connect to the web, browse the web, use your fingers to do so. White lists and black lists so people can't browse the places you don't want them to go to. A couple of text assets, flash animation can be embedded. 3D models, we support a large number of 3D model formats. Audio assets, maybe you want sound effects, somebody touches a button, there's a sound in the background. And Microsoft Deep Zoom images. These are the asset types. These are the things I can add to my design to represent the visuals that the users will see. And again, they can all be combined together. Whenever I add assets, whenever I add graphic content to my experience, you'll see them on the right side of the content library. So this guy on the right the content library contains a list of all of the graphic media and audio that I'm using in my experience. Unlike the space content panel on the bottom left that is space specific, the content library is universal, because I might use the same image in multiple spaces, for example. So the content library is universal, but I do have ways, go to meeting out of the way. I do have ways to filter this so I can see particular items, and I can do searches. So it's easy to find content. So all of my content is here and can be dragged into any particular space. Two last points about assets. Number one, you'll notice that some of them have controls. For example, a book has these arrows. The video has the play button, the rewind button. You can configure those as well. We actually introduced a brand new feature just a week ago called, called Experience Styles, Project Styles. So I hit the wrong menu item. It's under Project, on Project Settings. Brand new as of a week ago is this notion of experience styles. We have 3 pre-built experience styles, and you can create your own where you actually import your own icons. So maybe for the play button, you don't want to look like this at all. You want to look completely different? No problem. You can import the icons and assign it to the video assets. It's a nice new feature. Last point about assets is that we do distinguish between the graphic media, the audio, and the container. So you'll notice, for example, even for this image, if I pick this image, you'll notice in the Properties panel, there's a property called Image, and it's specifying which image. I can change that. I can pick any other image that I have in my, so here's this one, for example. I can pick any other image. We separate the notion of the container from the image, and that's very important because that means that you can change it at runtime. That means that what you create at design time does not have to be static. It can change. In fact, it is possible with Intuiface to build an experience where nothing is known at design time. You have no idea what images will be displayed or videos or what have you. All of it is determined based on user input and the time of day and the location of the machine or whatever you feel is relevant. And we can do that because we have a notion of a container separate from the notion of what's inside that container. So keep that in mind. So here we go. We just talked about assets. You're now an asset expert. We'll now talk about collections. Let me grab a bunch of images, drag them in, and I'll just insert them in the space for now. So I have 5 independent images, and I can resize them collectively. Now these are independent images. I can move them around like this. To introduce the notion of collections, let me start by highlighting all of these images and just choosing Add into Group. A group is a collection type in Intuiface, similar to what you're familiar with in something like PowerPoint. The idea is that you can take a whole bunch of stuff and make them operate singly. Notice if I drag the group, everything moves with it. In Intuiface, I would use a group to create a data sheet, for example, because what you do is you assign specific location for each asset or other collection inside that group. So you might have a text asset at the top and an image in the middle and then a video below that and some text below that, and it's a predefined format. And that's how you might use the group. Maybe a bit advanced for newbies, but available when you progress. Let's talk about some simpler collection types. I will choose Asset Grid to start. Asset Grid, this is rows and columns, presenting multiple assets and or collections. You can have collections inside collections, presenting multiple assets and collections in a single interactive context. The Asset Grid, that's rows and columns. We default to 1 row, multiple columns. To illustrate its use, let me increase the size of our content a little bit. Great, here we go. And I'm just pushing play, so I'm not doing anything fancy. I just increased the size of the graphic media inside this collection so you can see that once we're in play mode, I can use my finger to drag it to the left and drag it back to the right. See that? Now I have a way of showing a lot of media in an engaging way, in a method familiar to those that have, smartphones in their pocket. That's the asset grid collection. There are others. There's the asset flow. That's like the cover flow effect you might know from something like an iTunes where you're browsing albums. And the item in the middle is the biggest, then it goes off in the distance on the left and right side. There's the carousel, which is a cool one. I'll actually select that one. That's where you get circular representation of your items. Let me increase the size a little bit, reduce the view angle, maybe reduce the diameter a little bit. There you go. There's your carousel. Circular panel. So you can have a circular collection. It's actually infinite. There's a beginning and end to the circle, although you don't have to see it visually, but there's a beginning and an end. So if you have more items than fit in the circle, you could still use the circular panel. Flip chart, that's one item at a time. You literally are flipping from one item to the next. Group we discussed. Helix, that's like a strand of DNA. It's also infinite, so that eventually, if you have 100 items in your helix, if you keep swiping, 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 eventually item 1 will come up after item 100. So it's an infinite array, but it's got a nice, gorgeous helix effect to it. The map collection, the timeline, let's get back to that because they're too cool to just blow by. I want to show you those. Pinboard. You can think of that as a space in a space. A group assigns assets to very specific spatial locations. Their arrangement is important. Pinboards, it's not important. The idea is that there's a window to another space. You can manipulate things in there however you wish. An effect you might want for your experience. And then finally, the slideshow collection. That's the Ken Burns effect. Slow, pan, zoom, transition to new image. Pan, zoom, transition to new image. Unlike most collections, you're not really meant to interact with a slideshow. It's more for visual effect. So those are collections. It allows me to present multiple media in a single interactive context. As you'll learn in a bit when we talk about triggers and actions, you could even use it as a table of contents. And the user's selection inside the collection determines where they go to next, or just determines what happens. So it becomes a very powerful tool. Let's talk about the map and the timeline. I'm in the left-hand toolbar. I'm adding a map. We support 2 map types in Intuiface. We have OpenStreetMap and Bing Maps. OpenStreetMaps is free for everybody anyway, so it's free here. It works perfectly well. Bing Maps, technically you need an API key from Microsoft. You need to create a developer account. We document it online. I don't believe there's cost associated with it, but technically you have to have it. It's not our fault. Microsoft requires it. If you don't have the key, then there's a message that says you need a key. So by default, we go to OpenStreetMaps. This is a live feed. So if I double-click, even in edit mode, using my mouse wheel, I can browse into this live map. This is not on my machine. This is streaming over the web. Okay. If I did Bing Maps, I could have satellite view or street view, see roads or not. So a lot of configuration. For OpenStreetMaps, there is no satellite view. There's only the map view. This is where I am right now, Rockport, Massachusetts. So I've zoomed into Rockport, Massachusetts. Now this is nice. Right, it's nice. I have a map. I can interact with it. I can browse it. Great. But why is it a collection? Why do we call it a collection? Because you can add items into it. So let's do that. Here I have a little marker. One might find in a map, and I'm dragging it into my map. Now notice, if I go to the Space Content panel, it's a child of the map. It's inside the map. Okay, it's not separate. It's inside the map. And anything inside the map collection, inherits a latitude, see it down here in the Properties panel, a latitude coordinate and a longitude coordinate. And as I move it, okay, those coordinates are updating as well. That means that the map collection enables you to create points of interest, interactive points of interest that will move with the map because they're assigned with very specific coordinates. That point of interest could be an image, could be a video, could be a 3D model, could be a button, which we'll discuss later, enabling you to do whatever you want. Obvious uses might be all my retail locations or where all my friends are or all the alumni, whatever. But because the map is a collection, you can assign anything. It could be another collection. It could be a carousel. You can assign them to very specific map coordinates in a live map. The timeline is like the map collection, but instead of latitude, longitude, you're assigning dates. So instead of browsing a map, you're swiping your way through a timeline, and you can zoom in and zoom out of certain years, certain months, certain dates, and you're assigning assets and collections to dates. So you can tell the history of your business or whatever. All of these collections exist in part to accelerate your ability to create visually engaging content, but it also exists to create a lot of value. You can achieve more stuff. You can tell a better story. You can impart more information with the help of collections. It's a very powerful concept that I think is very easy to adopt. Not hard to do. Seb, any questions about this before we move on to properties?
Actually, yes. First, about the collections. Are timelines compatible with iPad Player? I don't think so at the moment. I will have to look in the iPad limitations page. I will answer that in the chat room for everyone. But I think the timeline is not yet in the iPad Player.
I don't think so, yeah. I don't think so.
What about...
What a specific question.
Yeah.
Very specific question.
What about a wayfinder? Can you build a custom interactive layout of a building for directions to point of interest? So yes and no. You can build a basic wayfinder like putting a map as an image and embed that in a group and put some points of interest on top of your image, which would be the plan of your building. When you touch any items on this plan, you could display some more information like the room number or the persons who is in this office or whatever. So using the groups and images, you can build something like that. Another question which you will answer in the next section with the properties, which is very important for all of our users. Can you import an image and lock its position and scale? So yes, of course. Jeff, I think maybe we can start the properties section by showing the container differences between free, pin, and static. And for the free one, you can show the allow move, allow rotate, allow resize. Are you okay with that?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Seb. So yeah, this is an excuse to talk about properties. As I mentioned earlier in this discussion, by default, an image, for example, is free. You can move it, manipulate it however you wish. You may not want to do that, and that's where the properties come in. Let me add a couple items to our space. So here's the PDF again. And this time I'll add a bunch of images, more Tim Burton images. So here's a whole bunch. Drag it in. In this case, I'm going to create a collection automatically. Rather than inserting individual images, let's insert a collection. And as always, it defaults to an asset grid collection. Well, here's a book. So first of all, in the properties panel, I can actually just say, do I want to be free, pinnable, or static? Free means it's unlimited manipulation. You cannot prevent it. Pin means there's a pin, and if it's pinned, you can't move it. If you unpin it, you can play with it. And then static means there's nothing you can do about it no matter what. You can even manipulate it further. You'll notice one of the properties is there's a category in the All Properties panel, because everything has actually a ton of properties, not just the basic stuff you see at the bottom of Composer. Some of the properties for pretty much everything in Intuiface are allow move, allow rotate, allow resize. So even if you set it to free, you can still prevent certain types of manipulation. This is very configurable. You can even constrain which direction, horizontal, vertical, or all. But there's tons of properties one can manipulate. Here's another one for the book. You'll notice that when we added the PDF to our experience, it defaulted to a horizontal scroll. You might have saw that in the play mode. It was scrolling it horizontally, which is nice, but we also have a book format, which I think is more visually appealing. So here's the book format, which is really just another property. For the collection, there's a few things that I think are really interesting, and let's start with this one. So I'm opening the All Properties panel. And under Behavior, I'm clicking two boxes, tap item to open and drag and drop item to open. So all I'm doing is clicking two boxes. Play. Now we have a PDF document formatted as a book, and we have a collection. The only thing I did in that collection was click those two text boxes. So first, here's the book. I'm using my finger. You notice how I can turn the page. See that? Or I can turn another page. All right? That's the book effect. The collection, here I am swiping left to right. Remember, there's a whole bunch of images in here. I really like Edward Scissorhands, so let's get him here. 1, 2, 3, touch. And here's a copy. Why? Because I selected Tap Item to Open in the Properties panel. Let's go through the collection a little bit more. Jack Nicholson is freaky, but I like Alice in Wonderland. 1, 2, 3, drag and drop. There's a copy. So anything inside a collection can be popped out as a copy. So you can, if that was a video, I can play the video. If it's a 3D model, I can now rotate the 3D model. So there are ways I can use the collection to present media that can then be put into a larger interactive context. You don't have to leave it inside that collection. So that's one neat example of how I could use properties to enhance my experience. There are other neat effects. So for example, here's the book, opening the All Properties panel. Under Visibility and Effects, we provide a variety of effects you could use to manipulate the visuals. So for example, let's manipulate opacity on the book. As I drop it, it slowly fades away, and I can bring it back. You'll notice blur, grayscale, sepia. So there's a lot of things we can do to manipulate the visuals. Keep in mind, Intuiface has an animation capability. Any property represented by a range of values can also be animated. So we'll get to that in a moment, but keep that in mind. Any property representing a range of values can even be animated. So for example, you don't jump from one opacity to the next. You can animate the transition from one opacity to the next. Here's another cool property example. We get this question all the time. How do I draw on the screen? How do I annotate images? So let's highlight all of the images inside this collection using the Space Content panel. Open the All Properties panel to show all the properties that are universal to these images. And under Tools, I'm turning on the Drawing Tools. So Drawing Tools will now be on. Let's change the gray line to red so it's easier to see. And we'll add one more pen width. There we go. So I don't know how many mouse clicks that was, but let's press play. This case, I still have Tap Item to Open and Drag Item to Open. So for example, here's Edward again. Let me tap that image. Here's a copy. And now there's a button on the left. If I touch it, it opens up the Drawing Tools. Red color. Here's the big brush. There's his nose, which I don't believe has had any work as he's gotten older. The Drawing Tools exist for both images and for the space entirely. So I can turn on Drawing Tools for the entire space and write on anything I want. And in either case, I can take a snapshot, I can take a picture, and then save it to file or email it, that sort of thing. So with just a couple clicks of the mouse, I now have Drawing Tools that I can use to annotate my entire screen. Pretty impressive. I hope. Now you're an expert of the composer layout, an asset and collection expert, a properties expert. And now we'll move on to triggers and actions. So have any questions?
Nope. You can go to the
Beautiful.
next one.
Triggers and actions. It's a very unique aspect of Intuiface, one of the key differentiators for anything even close to what we do, and there's not much close to what we do. And conceptually, when you hear about it, you think, my gosh, you got to have that. It's an if-then. If this happens, then do that. If you're going to have an interactive experience, you kind of have to have that. If this happens, then do that. To illustrate this point, we'll start with a button. In the left-hand quick access toolbar, I'm clicking the button. It's adding a button to my space. Here it is. Buttons exist to be a trigger source. That's why they exist, to be a trigger, to make something happen. So Intuiface has a button. In fact, we have two kinds of buttons. We have this simple button, so I can change the text. So this says press me, and I can change the fill color. So let's make it a nice little green here, whatever. We also have an image button. An image button enables me to have a pressed image and a released image. In other words, it doesn't have to look like a button. It could look like any image you want. The user doesn't even know that under the covers it's an image. It's a button. Under the covers it's a button. Visually, it's just an image. It could be any image you want. Could even be invisible, which is one way you could do image maps. Just put an invisible button over some complex graphic. As far as your user is concerned, they're touching the graphic. Under the covers, they touch a button they never saw. So here we have a button. which currently does nothing, right? I added a button, but it's a button with no purpose in life. We need to give it a purpose in life, which is where this triggers and actions panel comes in on the bottom right. So let me open it up. With a button, we always default to is released. So when the press me button is pressed and released, then do something. And the something has not been specified yet. You'll notice you could choose is pressed instead of is released as the trigger. We default to is released because it allows the person to change their mind. They can touch the button but drag the finger off. There was never a release, so the trigger is not activated. If you did is pressed, you can't change your mind. The second your finger touches the button, it goes. So when the button called press me is pressed and released, then what? So let me click the what clause, and I'll say space to space navigation, go to the space named properties. Digest that for a moment. This is how you do navigation in Intuiface. You pick a trigger. Doesn't have to be a button. There's over 200 triggers, possible triggers in Intuiface. Pick a trigger, and when that trigger is detected, you call the navigation action. Let's see it. Here we have a space comprised of nothing but a title, a logo, a background image, and one button. 1, 2, 3, touch, and now we're on the property space. Typically, when one thinks of triggers, one thinks of user actions. They touch something, right? Well, not only do we support triggers related to things like buttons, what other touch events do we support? On-screen swiping. So watch this. I'm going to touch my finger in the bottom right corner of this space. In fact, I could touch any part of the space where there isn't some pre-existing asset, like the bottom right corner. So 1, 2, 3, swipe. And now I'm back to the triggers and action space. Why? Because the swipe gesture is a trigger. In fact, it's a trigger on every space in this experience. So here we are. I'm on the space, and here in the triggers and actions panel, to text and gesture, swipe left, go to the next space, to text and gesture, swipe right, go to the previous space. In fact, we recognize, I think, about 20 on-screen gestures. And interestingly, here we're using next and previous. So this is literally the order of the spaces in the spaces panel. So this is an instance where the order actually has relevance. We also have backward and forward, which is whatever one you visited last, regardless of the order of the spaces. Wherever you came from last, go back to that, like on a website. So you can do that as well. So now you get a sense of triggers in the context of user actions, but it could also be environmental. So here's another example. It has nothing to do with the user. And this addresses another question we get a lot, which is, how do I make sure a kiosk in a public place doesn't get stuck somewhere that will not attract attention? And the answer is, use an inactivity timer. So let me show you how that works. I'm on the space itself. Notice I'm not in any particular item. I'm on the space itself, and I'm adding a trigger in the timers category. So when the space has been inactive for 3 seconds, then do something. In this case, let's do the navigation again. Navigation, go to the space name, properties. So if nothing happens for 3 seconds, then this will navigate us to a new space. Let's try it. All right. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. There it goes. If you have an experience in a public place, you've probably created some sort of attract loop that's designed to get attention, have people approach, and start interacting. If somebody uses that experience, they might walk away who knows where. So what you do is you create inactivity timers in all the spaces. Maybe it's 5 minutes. I mean, you need to pick a sufficient cushion. But you pick a timer that says if nothing happens in X number of seconds, then go back to that attract loop space. Easy, right? Come on, it's easy. There are over 200 triggers, over 200 actions in Intuiface. Some are specific to assets, like play video is a very specific action for a video, right? Others, like hide, are very generic actions that pretty much affect every asset and collection in the product. And remember what I told you, even animation is an action. Let's add an image back. So here's Edward Scissorhands. Make it a little smaller, okay. Rather than navigating to a new space, let's use the button to move the image. So when the button is pressed and released, then no, don't go to a space. I want to take the Edward Scissorhands image and move it somewhere, move to. So I can pick a new XY coordinate. So when the button is pressed, I want to move this image. So here's the image. I want to move it to a new position on screen. This little puppy right here, Show Timing and Animation, says don't just move it, animate that move. It's not a jump. How long till it starts? Do you want to show the transition in between? How long should that take? What kind of speed should it exhibit? Very fast at the beginning, very slow at the end. Do you want it to repeat? Do you want to go back and forth, back and forth? Because that property, X, and the property Y represents a range of values, you can animate the transition. In fact, because a trigger can cause more than one action to occur, notice it says add another action. One trigger could be associated with 50 actions. You could animate each individual action and use this little timeline here to orchestrate them. First do this, then do these 3, then do those 5, then wait 2 seconds, then do this. You can orchestrate all of the animation. Very powerful. And it's just another action. That's all it is. Now, I don't expect you to be an expert right now, but I think with just a little bit of play, you'll get the hang of it. Last point about triggers and actions. Actions can be acted upon remotely. A trigger in experience A can cause an action to occur in experience B. They could be in the same room. They could be in different countries. As long as they're on the network and can talk to each other, a trigger in experience A can cause an action in experience B. So for example, I might have one interactive experience, which is a kiosk, and another interactive experience, which is just meant to play video. And depending on what the person does in the kiosk determines what video is played in the second display. That's possible because the actions in the kiosk could be used to trigger particular videos in the second experience. One simple example. So you'd be surprised at what you can achieve with triggers and actions. It's really amazing. Again, my job is to be impressed by my own product, but hopefully you are too.
Jeff, one quick question.
Seb, any questions about that?
Yes, actually. We have a few questions about how to copy and paste triggers regarding the swipe left, swipe right gesture, for example. So one nice thing is that you can copy either a trigger and all of its actions directly from a space to another one, from an asset to another one, or copy one single action from a trigger to another trigger. So you can do everything of those combinations. Just doing a right click. Jeff, can you maybe show a right click on the trigger? So here I have cut, copy, paste, and duplicate as usual. You can also move them to reorganize them in the list, etc. Another nice thing, as soon as you've created your first space with those swipe left, swipe right triggers, if you duplicate the space, the new space will have the exact same triggers and actions. So think before going into creating an experience, maybe do a little mock-up on a paperboard, and so you can see in advance what will be the navigation of your inside your experience. That's it for the questions for the moment.
Thanks, Seb. Yeah, keep in mind all triggers are associated. Triggers don't live in isolation. They're always associated with something. Could be the space, could be a button, could be an image. So if you copy that thing, it copies the triggers and actions with it, right? They're kind of tied together. And as Seb said, you can copy trigger and action. You can copy an asset with triggers and actions. You copy a space that contains assets with triggers and actions. And by the way, you can run composers side by side on the same PC. So you can even have multiple experiences running at the same time in edit mode, and you can move things between them. Design accelerators. This brings us to the other tab in the upper right. We had the content library, but what's this poor guy? Design accelerators. These are images, videos, spaces, groups of content, things that we have pre-built for you to accelerate your ability to create visually appealing, engaging, interactive experiences. Could be just background images and videos for the background. I showed you how to change the background image. Well, we have a whole bunch of pre-built stuff you might find interesting you want to incorporate. This is all free, by the way. None of this costs money. Anybody can use these things. Anybody, anybody. We have a variety of buttons that we've pre-built with different styles you might want to use to incorporate. Rather than having a button that says press me, you can use one of these things, right? We have pre-built clocks, so you can tell the time. Then using an interface asset, which we'll get to a little later in the webinar, but different ways of representing the time. Lots of menus that can fly in and fly out that people can use. Sound effects, visual effects, a whole bunch of pre-built content that you can use in your experience. Most of it is not pre-installed. We pre-install a subset. If you want more, you click the Get Accelerators button. When you click that button, a panel opens up. You can download other bundles. That's what design accelerators are for. Let me add one cool example, which is through touch gestures. Even the best design, if it's meant to be interactive, may not be completely intuitive. Certainly demographically, depending on the age and experience of your audience, they may just not know to try certain things. Chances are you'll need at least some direction on screen. And if it's visual rather than words, that's a big help. There are some classic kind of gesture guidance for any kind of interactive display, and you can see that we pre-built it for you, and you can add it to your experience. And some of these are animated. So for example, here's an image that represents, go touch this thing please, tap here. In fact, in play mode, this thing is smart enough, it actually animates itself. Notice how it's breathing, it's getting bigger and smaller. It has its own trigger and action pair, basically. It has a sense of itself and says, okay, after a certain amount of time, start breathing, start getting bigger and smaller. So the DAs are not just static images. It can be actually very complex combinations of items. It can even be groups of a wide variety of content. Enterprise license alert. So if you have the Enterprise edition of Composer, you can create your own design accelerators because you might want to use them in different experiences or what have you. We pre-built a whole bunch. They're all free. You don't have to pay for them. You can download them whenever you want, use them whenever you want, no attribution necessary. And with the Enterprise Edition, you can create your own. Next, last but not least, in terms of design capability, are interface assets and binding. This is a world unto itself. It's brilliant. Takes a little more time to get used to. Let's talk about it. Interface assets enable you to interface with any external data source, any external device, any external business logic. Data, business logic, devices. Why would you want to interface with data, business logic, and devices? Because you don't want a static experience. You want an experience that can react to the environment dynamically, that has to change perhaps on a second-by-second basis, that might be different from one day to the next. That's why you need interfaces. So you can dynamically, in real time, access data or write data, access business logic or write to that business logic, or access devices to pull information from or drive it to that device. For data, could be Excel, could be a database, could be some REST-based web service. For business logic, could be a search function. We're often asked, we have a database, do you have a search function for databases? Never, because there's a million search functions. We'll never have the right one for you. You write the search function and then build an interface that teaches Composer how to talk to your search function. Devices, for example, we support the Philips Hue light bulb out of the box. That means that out of the box, using an Intuiface experience, you can tell a Philips Hue light bulb to turn on, to turn off, to change its color, to flash. Why? Because the Philips Hue has an SDK, and it listens for requests. It's on the internet. Philips Hue light bulbs are on the internet, so you can talk to it from Intuiface. This explodes what you can do with Intuiface because you're not limited to the static content in your device. We pre-built a whole bunch of interface assets. I click that bottom button, the left-hand quick access toolbar. That bottom button opens up the Select an Interface panel. Here are the pre-built interfaces anybody, including free edition, can use. Writing to and reading from Excel. Analytics. Keeping track of the most popular product, the most popular video, the most popular space, and collecting that information across multiple devices, maybe in multiple locations. A chronometer, a clock, a countdown timer, even a scheduler. Between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock on Tuesday, show this video. Between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock on Wednesday, show that video. You can schedule things with the schedule interface asset. That's logic. That's business logic. These are pre-built things. They work out of the box. Comparing two values, a global variable, linear conversion, random number generator. Save to the file system. Send an email, perhaps adding an attachment. Save to a USB key. Do a live Flickr search. Show a blog in real time. Do a live tweet list search. Address to coordinates. This is geolocation, converting latitude, longitude, and address, or vice versa. We support connect out of the box. We use interface assets. We support leak motion out of the box. We use interface assets. Tablet orientation for iPad, for Android. Is it landscape? Is it portrait? Is it flat? You can use those as triggers. Here's the Philips Hue light bulb, QR code generation, and local weather. All of these are built out of the box. Sorry, I had two in this one. All of them are built out of the box that you can use in your experience. Let's illustrate with local weather. So we have what we call a data template associated with each out-of-the-box interface asset. It exists to illustrate what is possible with that interface asset. You do not have to use this thing. This visual is just something we've built as a quick start. You'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner, here they are, the images, the videos, the documents. It's inside a group. You can completely change the look and feel. It's just a way to illustrate how it works. This temperature is not on my machine. This is a live web service in the cloud somewhere. I don't even know who hosts this thing. Somebody out there lets you ask it for the weather for a given city, and we're getting that information back live. If I select the interface asset here, I can change the location live. So let's call this London. And there's the temperature in London, coming back live. I'm not faking it with pre-built data. Anything on the internet that can answer questions using either REST-based web services, .NET DLLs, or JavaScript functions, you can communicate with using Intuiface. Period, end of story. Which means just about everything on the planet. If it's on the internet and can answer questions, you can probably talk to it from Intuiface. The interface assets enable that conversation, but how do you actually show it? Let's say that here's the weather service. I'm saying, please give me the weather for London, and it's sending back the weather for London. But how do I show that information coming back? That's what the binding is about. The binding enables you to take some value and give it to something else. To take a value from the web service and give it to a text asset, for example. Let's illustrate that. See this logo in the upper right? If I click it, you'll note in the Properties panel, its X and Y coordinates are orange. What that means is the X and Y coordinates are not determined by how it's placed here, but determined by something else. This logo is bound to something else, and that something else is determining the X and Y coordinates. If I click X, for example, it's showing me exactly what it's bound to. And in fact, so here's the logo on my page. Here's the source of the data of the X value and the Y value. Interestingly, it's in a different space. So on the introduction space in this experience is an image, and that image is supplying the X and Y coordinates. Let's prove it. Let's go to the introduction space. So here we are on the introduction space. Here's the logo, and I'm dragging it down to the bottom and then heading back to the space we just left. Well, lo and behold, there's the logo on the bottom because it's bound to it. That X value is coming from a completely different space. With our most recent release, version 4.8 that came out last week, we've enhanced this even further. We call them binding converters. So right now, this is a literal binding. Whatever the X is here, that's the X here. But what if you want to convert that value? You don't want it to be 1765. You want it to be half of 1765. If I touch this little swirly guy, it opens up the list of available converters that says take the source value and do something to it before you give it to the target. So you can manipulate text, number formats, date formats. You can do add, subtract, multiply, divide. So you don't just have to take the raw value. You can manipulate that value before you hand it along. It's an advanced topic. I won't spend more time on it now, but it's a beautiful topic. I can tell you I've been to shows and I've seen experiences. I really didn't know they built it with Composer, with Intuiface, because it was so customized and did such funky stuff using interface assets and binding that I couldn't even intuit it at first. It's amazing what you can achieve with binding and interface assets. You don't need interface assets to use binding. I didn't for the logo, right? There's no interface assets for the logo. There's just an image on one space and another image on another, and they're bound. You don't have to use it, but interface assets depend on it. So one day, we'll have another webinar. We'll spend a lot more time on interface assets and binding so you can become an expert. Any more questions, Seb, before we wrap things up?
Actually, I answered all of them in the chat room. And you just said what I wanted to add. Basically, the advanced webinar will cover those bindings, interface assets, and converters a bit more than what we are showing here. For more information, I just published a link on the chat room regarding the interface assets. We have lots of things on this online documentation, so please go and visit those articles if you have any questions about that.
Thanks, Seb. So we've just spent all our time discussing how to create an interactive experience and spent just a little bit of time talking about sharing and deploying it. Because at the end of the day, you're not just building it for yourself for the pleasure of building something. You're building it because you have an audience. You maybe have colleagues you want to share it with, do some collaborative work. You have a client you want to give it to. You want to deploy it, get it at the show. Step one, if you want to share or deploy, you're going to publish. Now, technically, you don't have to publish formally. You could just put the project on a USB stick and walk all over the place and plug it in. You could manually do that. But by publishing and putting it into the cloud, it vastly speeds up the process of sharing and deploying. When you publish from Composer under the File menu, you see Publish? What you're doing is you're creating a copy of this experience in your cloud account. This is not ours. We're not hosting anything. You're not paying us for cloud. It's your Amazon S3, Box, Dropbox, or FTP account. You're creating a copy of your experience in your cloud account. And once it's in the cloud, then it makes sharing and deployment significantly easier. Everybody can publish. Free edition, paid edition, it doesn't matter. Everybody can publish. And everybody can share. So once it's published, and you use Management Console to configure that, once it's published, open Management Console, and you can see all of the published experiences. That's one of its two jobs, is to help you manage your experiences. You select an experience, it opens an information panel, and at the bottom, you can say who you want to share it with. You use email addresses there. Once you add your email addresses and push share, we send out an email to everybody saying, hey, something's available. If the email address is associated with an existing experience, the email knows that. It says, hey, somebody just shared with you an Intuiface experience, go open it up. If the email address is not associated with an existing Intuiface account, the email says, hey, somebody shared something cool with you. You need to create an account. Here's how you do it. So we send the email. And then people can download it, and they can open it up on their desktop. It could be Composer, it could be Player. There are three ways to share. You can share with write privileges, so people can modify the master. You can share with read-only privileges, which lets the person save their own copy, but they can't change the master. You can even share as play-only, which means you can't edit it at all in Composer. You can only play it in Composer. The ability to share with write privileges and the ability to share as play-only is an Enterprise Edition feature. So there's another feature that requires you to be in possession of an Enterprise Composer license. The ability to share with write privileges, the ability to share as play-only. Everybody can share as read-only, which gives you the ability to save as and have a local copy. You might be sharing with colleagues, you might be sharing with clients, right? Doesn't matter who it is. You share with anybody you want. When you're ready to deploy, you're back in Management Console, but now instead of sharing, you're deploying. Every player associated with your Intuiface account and that is on the network, on the internet, will be listed in the bottom of Management Console. See where it says Connected Devices? Let me make that a little bigger. See at the bottom where it says Connected Devices? These are all of the devices on the planet that are on the Internet and are running Player associated with your Intuiface account. Could be Windows, iPad, Android, or the Samsung Smart Signage platform. All of those platforms, if it's running Player and it's on the Internet, there you go. It's going to show up in this list. To deploy an experience, I drag it from the top, put it on the bottom, and boom, it's automatically copied and optionally run. You need to have an enterprise license to do that. Now look, if you've got 100 devices, you could walk to each of the 100 devices and try to configure things, or you do one drag and drop. If I have 10 devices in Chicago, but I have 100 devices around the country, I could tag my 10 devices with Chicago, enter the tag to filter it, and do a single drag and drop. And my experience is deployed on all 10 devices in Chicago, or whatever I tagged it to. So you can imagine, for large deployments, for geographically inconvenient deployments, you really need this. Have to have an enterprise license to do so, at least one. So that's Management Console for managing your experiences, for sharing them and for deploying them. Works like a charm. We covered a lot of ground. The idea was to introduce you to it, not, as I jokingly said, to make you an expert. Certainly there are other topics. You could dig into analytics more deeply. How to collect usage information, what's the most popular, the least popular, collect it across multiple devices, analyze that information offline. There's a lot more to learn about Player for iPad, Android, and Samsung SSP. There's also Player for Windows, but you're using that in Composer. These are different platforms. You might want to get more familiar with it. All of this is documented online. Content import. For example, you can just drag and drop a PSD file. And Composer is smart enough to detect the various layers and to import things as individual images. Really speeds up the process of working with the design team. There's also PowerPoint. There's also Excel. You can import a bunch of 3D models. So there's a lot of formats that are supported with different asset types. Remote control. I might have a giant non-interactive display. Maybe I'm in front of an audience of 1,000. I can walk around the room with an iPad in hand and use our remote control to drive the experience everybody can see in the giant projected display. The remote control is free. That's not Player. That's different. That's a remote control because you're remotely running an experience and controlling it. iPad, Android, Windows, all three platforms that has the remote control for free. Scheduling. Again, that uses cron statements, cron expressions, which you may not be familiar with, but you can schedule anything for any time of day, any day of the week, any year. You can be very specific. And the remote actions are something you might want to investigate, as we discussed earlier. These are just some of the topics we touched on. A lot more is documented online, and will give you even more power in controlling how you deploy, how things operate, the kind of information you collect, etc. All of this is documented, as I say, online. Let's talk about what's available. There's the tutorial. You've done the most important thing, which is listen to this webinar, because it's live. You get to see me using the product. You get to ask questions. Maybe the second most important thing is the tutorial, because it forces you to use the product. You're exposed to it. You get to make your own collection. You get to make your own layouts, and I think it's a good exposure. There are a whole bunch of instructional videos. You get to hear my voice going in depth and a little more deeply in various topics. There's over 200 articles in our online documentation. We call it the knowledge base. If there's a better documented product in the world, I don't know. We try very hard to talk about everything online. We're very proud of it. There's the webinar, of course. Discussion forums. You can ask questions, search pre-existing answers. We have a fantastic support team. Don't be shy. And then a whole bunch of samples that we've created, enabling you to see things that we've built, play it, take it apart, see how we built it. You'll find them in the Experiences panel. Let me open that up in Composer. So here's the Experiences panel. The fourth tab is called Samples. All of these samples were pre-built by us. You can download all of them yourself. You can play them. You can break them, see how we built them. It's a good exposure to the variety of what's possible and give you an insight to how to achieve maybe some more advanced effects. We'd like to think that there's a ton of quality material enabling you to self-educate. So although we're sometimes asked, not often, we're sometimes asked, do you have paid training? Can you train us? I always say, do me a favor, review this stuff first. I guarantee you the product is easier than you think, and you really may not need to pay us to train you. So definitely run through this content first. Seb, we've reached the end. How are we on questions?
Last question on my side. How often does the device check in into the management side, and if they do not need to be updated, does the device have to stay connected to the internet? So if we are talking about a player and the management console, so basically when you drag and drop an experience on the player in the management console, it's going to be deployed in the next, I don't remember if it's 10 seconds or 30 seconds, but something like that, a few seconds. The player will receive the order to download the experience, if it's not already local, and then to launch it. So that's the kind of frequency we have for both.
A differential download, by the way. It only downloads the differences if it's downloaded before.
Correct. And this works for all our platforms, meaning Windows, iPad, Android, and the Samsung Smart Signage platform. If you have already downloaded your experience and the player is running, you don't need to be connected to the web, to the internet, depending on your license version. If you have a month-to-month player license, you need to be connected at least once a month, so we can check that the license is still valid. So basically, it depends on the license that you would have. I think that's it for the questions on my side.
Well, either I did a great job or people are very shy. But either way, Seb and I will stay online a bit longer. So if people have additional questions, please ask them. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time. You didn't have to do this. You have a very busy day, I'm sure. So I appreciate the effort to and the incentive that you've taken to learn our product and develop some skills. I really, really believe you'll be impressed by what you can achieve and find a lot of uses for it. But thank you so much for your time, and good luck using the product.